and welcome to another episode of Leadership Love Notes. I'm Caitlin, an advisor at IG Advisors and host and producer of this limited edition podcast, which is all about social impact leadership. I'm joined by my wonderful co-host and producer, Elena.
Hi, I'm Elena, an intern at IG Advisor and a co-producer of this space.
And just to recap who we are and what we're doing together today, IG Advisors is an award-winning strategy consultancy, and we work with the philanthropy, business and non-profit spaces for social and environmental change. We are coaches, we are mentors, we are leaders ourselves, and we run the well-known Leadership Lab training program, which is a 6-week course for social and environmental impact professionals looking to take their leadership to the next level. And we'll drop all the details in the description of this video. Today, we're very excited to be talking about tricky leadership transitions. So what happens when your leadership changes and how do you facilitate that transition smoothly and successfully? And we have two wonderful guests with us today. So Emily, Alisha, over to you to introduce yourselves.
Emily, you go first. Oh,
thank you.
No, you go.
What a transition that was. Hi everyone, my name is Emily Collins-Ellis. I'm the CEO at IG Advisors, and I've been working at IG for almost a decade, so I keep telling the team to plan my anniversary party. And a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago now, I was fortunate enough to take the helm of IG from the previous CEO, which was Alisha.
And my name is Alisha Fernandez Miranda. I am the former CEO and current chair of IG Advisors, a firm that I founded alongside my husband Carlos in 2011. And I've seen all the leadership transitions because IG was my nights and weekends job first until 2015. I never remember the dates. And then I was managing director when I first joined, then CEO, and then with so much joy and pleasure and love, because I'm glad this is called Leadership Love Notes, was able to pass the baton to Emily and continue on as chair. And I'm delighted to be here today with everyone.
It's actually called Leadership Lab Notes, but I think we should rebrand.
Oh, Lab Notes.
I
heard love, and I was like, that's the best name for a podcast I've ever heard. Oh, wow. Okay. I also like Leadership Lab Notes, but I think we should think about Leadership Love Notes because
transition also.
Well, you know what? But what an underutilized word when thinking about leadership, when really it's at the root of so much of what we do. So, all right, I'm going to petition for a name change, but we can do that later.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We're very, very happy to have you on our podcast and to have this conversation with you. So to get us started, why don't you guys tell us a little bit about your experience with leadership transition?
Well, I feel like in my career so far, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of leadership transitions. I feel like for me, the transition of leadership falls into kind of like 3 categories. There's the emergency ones, so when someone falls ill or dies, both of which I've sadly experienced in my career. There's the carefully planned ones, so founder transitions, intergenerational transitions, parental leave transitions, all of which I've either been a part of or worked with clients on. And then there's the poorly planned ones, which I've certainly supported a lot of my clients or coached a lot of my clients through. So as I said, my most notable experiences, my most recent ones, taking over as CEO of IG from Alisha. That meant taking the helm of an organization that she and Carlos had founded, shifting to starting to work with them as peers after spending a lot of years with them as my managers. And it was definitely a big shift in our kind of working dynamic, as well as obviously how the organization ran. But honestly, I feel like we nailed it. So I'm happy to dig into that more.
Yeah, I love your breakdown, Emily, of those 3 types. I would only add that prior to joining IG full-time, I spent about 8 years or so, maybe a few more, in very large companies, where I was, of course, on the philanthropy side of things, but very, very big, tens of thousands of people, multinational businesses, and was privy to many a poorly planned leadership transition in those places. I would say I worked at a big bank for about 5 years. And in that time, I think I had 6 different bosses who were leading the team. And it was very political. It was political how people got moved up and down. It was like this. It wasn't an emergency, but it always felt like an emergency. Things happened very quickly. And I will say that I learned so much from those poorly planned leadership transitions that informed how we went into our wonderfully planned leadership transition, I think, at IG.
I love that. And building on from that, you've both mentioned poorly planned transitions and how it's very possible to do a transition badly. So I'm wondering, what are some of the common challenges that you've seen, and what are your recommendations? You said you nailed the IG advisors leadership transition, so what works?
For me, I think the things that I see people get wrong, and also the things we were avoiding trying to get wrong during our leadership transition, is firstly, not talking enough about all the ways that relationship dynamics, decision-making processes, conflict resolution, all those things need to change and will change during a leadership transition. But if you're not talking about them, they'll change in ways that have a life of their own, and people won't necessarily be brought into that process. The people who are going through the leadership transition themselves won't, but also the kind of wider team and everyone else that it affects. So assuming that everyone will just figure it out is not a good way to go about it. So talking. And then related to that, I think a challenge that we see others go through is trying to do it on their own, just trying to kind of bootstrap it and figure it out. During our process, we had 2 transition coaches on kind of either side of the process, so to speak, that were supporting us to think about the personal, professional, organizational, external implications of what we were doing, articulating what we wanted and needed from that. And I think, honestly, that was just a game changer. It was a game changer for me just as a person in my career, never mind the specific transition that we were going through. And then I'd say finally, kind of to Alisha's point before, trying to rush it, I think is something that we see a lot of people get wrong. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of time, obviously, if it's an emergency transition, but for us, we planned it for a long time. We discussed it for more than 2 years. We ramped up internal communications over the 12 months leading up to it. We ironed out loads of details before we got to that critical moment. And in fact, by the time we announced it publicly, it kind of didn't feel like news anymore. Everyone was like, congratulations. And I was like, yeah, I know, it's just been happening for a while. But with some of my clients, whether their transitions are emergency or planned ones, I really see a lot of rushed responses. So rushed promotions, rushed restructures, setting people up to fail, a lack of support and discussion from boards and leaders. And so even when you don't have the luxury of time, I think taking a moment to take stock and really talk things through is really important, to make sure that it's not just okay right now, but that it's okay in a sustainable way going forward.
Yeah, I think some people think about the transition as the moment of change, or maybe like the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks after. But actually, most transitions, even if they are rushed, have a very long time scale in which you can be thinking about things. And if you don't have a ton of advance notice, there's still a long tail to that I think needs to be thoughtfully planned and tended to, because a transition is not just the day when things change or when you send the email announcement or something like that. But I think it's all of the impacts that ripple out off the back of it. We did, as Emily said, had these incredible coaches who came in to help us think about our transition. And one thing they really hammered home for me were these softer elements of what the transition would mean in terms of just those very human emotions that not just we had as Carlos and I doing succession planning, as Emily stepping into this role, but that the rest of the team were going to have, that our clients were going to have. And to not undervalue those kind of very tricky, almost harder to quantify things that weren't like who's going to be managing who or how are we going to communicate this, but really a lot of the feelings that are involved in this. I think one thing I've noticed in a lot of transitions I've been a part of, either on the kind of employee side or actually driving the transition, has been that I think ultimately there is the opening for a lot of fear in a transition, and that's a very human emotion. And even if the transition is happening at a different level of the business, let's say that you're at there is still this opportunity to worry about what it's going to mean for you and your job and your life and the real things that matter to you. And so I think that prioritizing some of those emotional, softer, maybe, less kind of practical elements of a transition are super important, and something that I don't see happen as often as it should. I was very glad that we had the guidance and support to help us think about those things as we were going through our own.
I love that. I love that we always need to remember that we're all humans, and that there's a softer part to all humans that we need to tender to, and that needs to be fostered even at this time, especially at those time of like a lot of change and a lot of switch and responsibilities.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add is, in addition to thinking about that, what are your needs as individuals, what are the needs of your wider team and organisation, there's also that lens of externally, what are people understanding about this leadership transition, which is another area where I see a lot of organisations getting it wrong or really, really struggling and coming to us asking for support. There could be concerns about what that means for fundraising, what that means for their positioning and reputation in the space. And to your point, thinking about it as a longer journey and a longer process, and thinking about the people. If you're concerned about your funders, then what do you know about them as people, and how can you guide them on that journey on a really personal level? Makes a big difference.
I love that, Caitlin. Can I just add one thing, which is that when we work with clients at IG on grant-making clients, particularly individuals or families, on helping them kind of determine who to give their funding to, we do look at leadership as a really big piece of that. And it's not that a leadership transition is a red flag or a negative thing, but I think a poorly handled leadership transition is the type of thing that would cause us to say, hold on, we need to understand more about this before we're going to advise you to release some funding in this area. It's so important to bring in those stakeholders, and it will have, practical real life impacts on how your funders perceive you. We make those decisions, we make those calls all the time. And I think where we see organizations getting it wrong is when they're not open and communicative, when there isn't even if there hasn't been a longer lead time, when there isn't that openness to explain why this is happening, how it's happening, how they're planning and thinking through it. And it is absolutely the type of thing we would take into account when advising a donor on where and how to give.
Well, about these softer skills, softer aspects of leadership transitions that we've been talking about, this leads us very nicely to our next question, which is, what role does trust play in leadership transition? How can you establish trust with your team and with your previous manager during the transition?
So I would say, actually, when it comes to trust, that the most important thing to build trust in during a transition is yourself. Because I coach so many people, particularly women, who are going through leadership changes, and they have these stories about how people won't see them as the real leader, or they won't think they've earned it, or they won't respect or listen to them, or they'll judge them for their decisions. And of course, those anxieties come with, change of any kind. And sometimes it might be true, you might have a particularly hostile work environment, but if you're trusting of your own skills and your own instincts and your own experience that got you into the leadership position, it's so much easier to be resilient in the face of those challenges. And it's also easier to see where some of those stories might be coming from your inner critic rather than reality. So I think building that trust in yourself is something that can really help you to navigate any complexities that come, any kind of challenges that come through this type of process. But secondly, I'd say that this question of trust is actually one of the biggest questions that I posed to Alisha and Carlos when we were navigating our leadership transition. I knew that they'd seen me and supported me through lots of different stages of learning and development. And I also knew that I would want and need a lot of autonomy to fully take up my role as CEO, rather than always starting from a place of what they would do or what they would want. And that was a big shift for me. I needed to trust myself, but I also needed to ask them, what gives you the most confidence and trust in me, so that you can give me that autonomy and we can work together differently. And also what lessons you're trusting me, right? Where are we going to run into issues? Because that's not something that you necessarily directly say to your manager a lot of the time when you're in that kind of more traditional working relationship. So kind of shifting through this transition, that was one of my biggest questions. And what I heard, although Alisha, you can embellish here, was so many of the obvious things, really good communication, frequent communication, a really clear framework of what decisions were mine to own versus things that we wanted to be a group discussion and work through together, which is not necessarily just about decision-making power, but like when are three brains better than one, and also being really clear on what our shared vision was that we were working towards. And I will say on the shared vision side of things that when you go through a leadership transition, sometimes it can be hard to see, if you're the person stepping into the leadership role, it can be hard to see your vision if you have been following someone else's for a long time. And so for me, as well as support through coaching and support through the kind of educational courses that I was on, I took the time to try and articulate that independently from kind of a live conversation. And so that is one of the recommendation I would make is to have some asynchronous communication in the way that you're navigating developing a shared vision. In fact, I made a what was intended to start as a presentation for Carlos and Alisha about my vision and ended up being a 90-minute video that they had to watch with popcorn. I didn't mean it to be, but I just, had a lot to say once I gave myself the space to say that. So yes, I think that taking up that space probably helped you guys to build trust in the fact that I could do that, right? That I had something that I was bringing into that space. So yeah, those are the kind of things I would highlight around trust, as well as highlighting what Alisha previously said about thinking about your teams, showing that they can trust you to manage what can be an anxious time, and that you are building and maintaining those relationships through that time as well.
We legitimately put Emily on the TV. Like we cast her video to the TV and sat on the sofa and watched the entire video together. It's like, this is like bringing back such like fond memories of so much of what was beautiful about that process. I mean, I think our transition was a particular type of leadership transition, which was, succession planning and succession in the non-Roy family way. And we had the great gift of having known Emily and worked with Emily for many years before. So in a sense, that trust was established. I tell my kids all the time that trust is the foundation on which everything else is built, and that trust can't just be given, it has to be earned. And I feel that that's true in work as well. And so we already started from a place where we trusted Emily. And I imagine that any listeners going through a similar succession type transition are going to have a level of trust built into the person that they're going to be essentially handing over their baby to, because, that is it's a big, big step, and it's inherent in this process. So we trusted Emily as a person already implicitly with no qualms. And I think the other thing we had to learn to do was we had to trust this process that we were going through of transitioning. And we had to put in a process of knowing, what are we going to do when we don't agree on something? How are we going to set up, we did a RACI, which is the responsible, accountable, consulted, informed matrix. And we put that forward and we said, these are the points at which we're going to check in on how things are going. These are the systems and the mechanisms we're going to have for resolving any conflicts or disagreements we might have, and then we had to trust that process was going to help get us through. Part of that process was developed because we're all consultants and it's our favorite thing to do, to set up a process for things. And part of it was developed with the help of our coaches who had seen many transitions and were able to help us pinpoint these might be things that are tricky. But I think we had to go through this process, and we had to trust that we weren't going to get everything right the first time, and that there were going to be opportunities where we had to check back in, but we built a mechanism around ourselves that we felt like we could believe in was going to help us through the transition. So we had that personal and human trust already, and then we learned to trust in this transition process, which was new for all of us, really.
One other thing I'd add, which I don't think we've touched on yet, is building trust in external stakeholders. So you mentioned, Caitlin, funders and donors. For many of our clients, that is the main concern. At IG, obviously, we have lots of different clients. We have folks who are on our programs, and so the the element of our leadership transition where trust building was required, or we also took time around that. So any kind of relationships that were Carlos and Alicia's, they made sure to include me in meetings with those people. They made sure to kind of position me before the point at which it was clear that I was handing over. And then also the way we communicated built trust as well. So there was a kind of real story, which was not a spin, it was a kind of genuine narrative, right, of like everything that Carlos and Alisha had built, the decision that they were making to kind of shift their relationship to that, and then the story of myself and also our managing director Rachel, and how we'd kind of come into that, and so I think the trust building with external audiences is really important as well, because they don't have this inside track, right, they don't know our culture and what it's like to work with us, and they haven't necessarily built that same trust over time, and so the kind of positioning that's needed to build that trust, I think, is really, really important in any organization.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you've both spoken about both trust and the really emotional side of that, as well as a lot of really tangible, practical systems, processes, narrative tools that you can use to support and provide infrastructure for building and maintaining trust. And moving us on to our final question of the podcast, we've spoken a lot about preparing ourselves, our team, our external stakeholders for the transition. But for anyone who's just stepped into a new leadership role, those first 100 days, what are your top recommendations, your top tips to set them up for success?
Go on holiday. No, I'm kidding.
Leave.
I love that. That's a top tip for everyone, no matter what role you have. Go on holiday.
So I think 100 days is not a lot of time, right? We have 100 days left of 2024 at the point at which we're recording this. I think the most important thing is to start with just addressing that kind of emotional thing. Do not take your emotional temperature too soon in the first 100 days. Your team might be anxious, you might be doing a lot of things for the first time. Things in the first 100 days are not how they're going to be through the rest of time. And so just kind of give yourself grace, and obviously everyone else grace, that we're social creatures. Our emotions affect each other. So as you all collectively go through this change, just kind of give yourself grace and have space for your feelings, but don't necessarily trust that feelings you have in the first 100 days are how it's going to feel for the whole rest of time, if it's difficult, but also even if it's easy, right? If it's easy and chill, again, don't necessarily assume that that's how it will always be. Leadership is change. The second thing I'd say is relationship building or maintenance, depending on how long you've been in the organization. If you're new to an organization, this is especially important. But if you're not new and you have kind of pre-existing relationships, it's about shifting and maintaining those, right? You might have shifted in, you might have new team members sitting underneath you. You might have kind of been promoted above someone. There's lots of different dynamics that can come to play in that. So thinking about building relationships above all else and building them in a way that has a lot of listening embedded in them. So one of the first things I did when I started to become more senior within IG, and also something that I've advised other colleagues to do on that same journey, is what I describe as a listening tour. So really talking to everybody individually, understanding their experience of working in the organization, their goals, their ambitions, anything that they were finding difficult, anything that they wanted me to know as I was kind of taking on more responsibility and potentially making any changes. And so really bringing people into that process, that it's kind of a team process, but everybody feels heard. And also just repeatedly naming what is changing in those relationships. So for me, sometimes that was like, okay, I'm going to have a little bit less time for this thing that I used to do. So I just need you all to know that's not because I don't care. It's just because I'm doing something different now. Or I'm going to be much more involved in this thing because it's now much more central to my role. So if I'm over focusing on this, it's not because I'm micromanaging you. It's just because I need to understand it better or whatever. And there's lots of different examples of that. But sometimes if things change and you don't name them, people can feel a little bit out of control. Whereas if you keep talking about them, and then that's something that can really help people to feel more comfortable. And it's also something that can help you to keep a note of what is changing, right? Because so much can change during a leadership transition. And then the final thing I would say is not comparing yourself to anyone else. That might be the people who've come before you in your position. It might be people that you can see elsewhere on LinkedIn or whatever. It might be your parents or whatever it is. Don't compare yourself to other people's leadership journey. Define what yours is specifically, and then kind of live that, because comparison is a terrible way to feel good about yourself, but it's in the workplace it's really easy way to be disconnected from your actual vision and your goals, and to start to kind of like perform in somebody else's path. So that's a lot to fit in your first 100 days, but that would be my first 100-day advice.
I think those are all brilliant pieces of advice. And I'm trying not to panic about the fact that there's only 100 days left in the year. Thanks so much, Emily, for delivering that news to me right now. Do you know what's really interesting is that they say the first 100 days of the American presidency are their first 100 days in term are really your only opportunity to get anything done. This I learned from The West Wing, which is totally dating me, but it's a great show actually, and I think it probably stands up if you would like to go back and watch it. I don't know that for sure though, so don't quote me on it. I haven't watched it in a long time. But this idea that that's your like golden period to get all of your actions done when you have this kind of bump, you've been elected, and before you have to start campaigning for the next election, which is like 3.5 years away. And I think that in every other instance, I would probably say the opposite should be true of your first 100 days, which is to do as little as possible in the first 100 days and to, as Emily so beautifully said, listen as much as possible for the first 100 days. When I left the big bank, I went into another corporate foundation where I was responsible for managing a very large team of staff that were all around the world and taking over from the person who had founded that team and that initiative within the foundation, who was still there. She was just moving into a different role. So it was big shoes to fill, and it was a ton of stuff I had never done before in a sector I had never worked in before. And I wish I could remember who gave me the advice, which was to do nothing for the first 3 months in a job, or do as little as possible in terms of making change, and to really focus on learning as much as possible. Because there is nothing that people hate more than when somebody brand new walks in and says, you're doing all of this wrong, this is inefficient and not working the way it should, and I'm going to come in and change everything. Some of those things may actually be true, but if you don't create the trust, the space, and you really, really get under the skin of this new role that you're in, the new organization you're in, the new world you're in, no one is going to take you seriously, and you will have no legitimacy in trying to move any sort of agenda forward. So my advice for the first 100 days is not to do as little work as possible, but to make as few major changes as you can, particularly if you're jumping into a brand new organization where people have already been working and working hard for the big time. In that particular job, after my first 100 days, we did a restructure of the team. We had to move some people around. Some people left the organization. There were huge changes that had to be made off the back. But those things did not happen before I had really taken the opportunity to fully understand all 360 degrees of what it was we were trying to do and achieve. And so I really think that the idea that you need to go in and see some quick wins in your first 100 days, I really don't subscribe to that. I think the first 100 days are about learning and paying attention, deferring to people who know a lot, and just thinking, listening, preparing before you go in and try to move things forward that will inevitably need to happen.
Yeah, and as someone who has been part of a team where leadership has changed, that feeling of being listened to, being seen, and also the feeling of transparency, Emily, what you said around naming the changes that are happening, it's very helpful for the team. And can I just say, we have some excellent sound bites from this episode. Do as little as possible and go on holiday. Excellent advice. This is what people pay
Leadership for life. This is why we call it leadership love notes, because who's not going to love that? We don't call it that, guys. Sorry.
They want. Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for watching. Thanks to the wonderful Emily and Alisha for sharing all of those wonderful insights. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do remember to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. We've linked to all of our LinkedIn profiles in the description, so do give Emily and Alisha a follow. And if you enjoyed the chat, think about joining our Leadership Lab program, which is a 6-week training program for social and environmental impact professionals. And as I said, links to everything in the description. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.